Hey everyone, in my last video I showed you how to remove the starter on a Honda S2000. Today I'm going to show you how to install the starter back onto the Honda S2000. The first thing you want to do is insert the starter back into position. Lift the starter back into the engine bay the same way that you removed it. Generate clearance for it by brushing away the rubber fuel line and any other wiring harness that it comes into contact with. As you wiggle the starter back to its final position, be mindful that the knock sensor is a few inches away from the starter and is particularly delicate. Once the starter is back in the engine bay, move the fuel line brackets back into place and use a 10mm socket to install the two bolts that hold the fuel line brackets to the frame of the car. Torque them to 8.7 foot-pounds. Move the ground wires back into place and use a 10mm socket to reinstall the two bolts that secure the ground wires to the block. Torque them to 8.7 foot-pounds. Now you want to reinstall the starter. There are two bolts that need to be installed, the top and bottom starter bolts. Then you will have two wires. One wire is a starter signal wire which simply clips in, and the second wire is the power wire which is held in place by this nut. In order to access the top starter bolt, I use at least a 16-inch extension with a universal joint and a 14mm deep socket. Carefully insert the 14mm deep socket where the alternator used to sit and feed it towards the starter. You can stick your right hand underneath the intake manifold and help guide the socket towards the top starter bolt. Once the 14mm deep socket is near the top starter bolt, you'll want to ensure that the socket sits squarely on the bolt head so that you don't accidentally strip the bolt. You should be able to hand tighten it most of the way. Finally, torque it to 33 foot-pounds. Installation of the lower starter bolt can be done in the same way as the top starter bolt. Alternatively, it can be installed from underneath the car as well. Torque it to 33 foot-pounds as well. Now you want to install these starter wires. Reach your arm under the side of the intake manifold and push the signal wire back onto the clip located on the starter. Then insert the power wire back onto the starter and use a 12mm socket attached to a long extension to install the nut securing the power wire in place. Torque it to 7 foot-pounds. Lastly, replace the rubber caps on both the signal and starter wire. With the starter back in place, you can reinstall the alternator. If you need help installing your alternator, you can check out my alternator replacement video, which will be linked down below. Next, you will need to reinstall the air intake. If you need help reinstalling your air intake, you can check out my air intake installation video, which will be linked down below. Don't forget to reconnect the negative battery terminal. Now that you have some power, give your starter a quick test before you take the car off jack stands. All it should need is a quick stab to verify that it is in working order. If you do run into some trouble, double check the wires connected to the starter. Lastly, get your car off jack stands and lower it back down to the ground. If you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment down below for any DIY you'd like to see in the future.